Hello, welcome to Run Testers. My name's Nick and this is our first run review of the Polar Pacer Pro. So the first thing to probably say is that in terms of new features, the Polar Pacer Pro is not a very exciting new watch. It really doesn't boast anything particularly new for Polar in general, aside from a kind of a new walking fitness test. But what does make it exciting is that Polar is basically bringing all these features down a level in terms of pricing. This costs £259 and it's really got nearly all of the key features that you'll find on things like the Grit X Pro or the Vantage M. And they've also launched the Polar Pacer watch, which is coming in at £169.50, which is again is going to have loads of great features and basically be slightly better than the current Vantage M2. Actually, that's an important note. So basically with these new launches, Polar seems to be killing off the Polar Vantage M2 because this is the same price as that watch and offers just a lot more in terms of features and a nice design in my opinion. So it's kind of reshaping the range, trickling down a load of their key kind of training and kind of navigation features onto cheaper watches, and that's a good thing, even if there's not anything new to shout about really with these watches. So the Pacer Pro is aimed at runners, but it's actually a full multi-sport watch. I think Polar should probably highlight that a bit more because that's great at this price point. It has a kind of sleeker, lighter design than the Vantage series. It weighs 41 grams. The Pacer Pro has an aluminium bezel, while the kind of cheaper Pacer watch is an all plastic design. It also has a new, faster processor and more memory. It has a kind of what Polar's calling a brighter display, but still a memory and pixel color display like you'll find on kind of most sports watches. They haven't upgraded to AMOLED or anything like that here. Battery life is 35 hours of GPS or kind of around a week of general use, although you can extend it to 100 hours in kind of training mode using their various power saving modes. The watch is waterproof to 50 meters and it has a barometric altimeter which opens up some new features that weren't available on the M2. You're also getting an improved version of the Polar Precision Prime heart rate sensor that has a couple of extra LEDs to hopefully be more accurate. And Polar's also promised kind of better GPS accuracy due to a redesigned antenna, but there's no kind of multi-band support like you're starting to see crop up on some top-end watches. So the kind of key features that have dropped down from the Vantage V2 and Grit X watches are things like route navigation with turn-by-turn directions, hill splitter, performance tests for running and cycling, and a new walking kind of test that will give you your VO2 max after a brisk 15-minute walk. You're also getting Strava Live segments on the watch, and it's compatible with the Polar Shift kind of quick change bands. You're getting kind of the limited smart features that Polar offer as well on this watch, which includes obviously notifications, some kind of weather forecasting, and also music controls for your phone. You also get all the usual key features from Polar, such as extensive training analysis, impressive and kind of detailed sleep tracking that kind of results in you being recommended workouts the following day based on your recovery, and also fuel-wise, which can help you kind of fuel for kind of longer training sessions and races. So kind of the key question after all of this is why you would upgrade to a kind of Vantage V2 or Grit X Pro, which can be kind of anywhere up to around £180 more than this watch. Well, those watches have perhaps arguably nicer designs with kind of full aluminium bodies and kind of they're kind of chunkier and bigger, which some people will like. You're also getting kind of more detailed kind of recovery advice through Recovery Pro and the orthostatic tests. They also have touchscreens, although I'm going to say it's not a big loss. The touchscreens have never been very good on Polar watches. In terms of the differences between the Pacer Pro and the standard Pacer, the big one is kind of the barometric altimeter, which brings in a few new features, things like route navigation and hill splitter. And also the Pacer Pro has running power measured natively from the wrist, which you will not get on the cheaper Pacer watch. So Mike, Kieran and I have been out kind of for a first run with the watch today, and I think Tom is also getting the watch in, so we'll have a lot of detail for our full review down the line, but for now just going to give you our early thoughts on the watch after a one run and where it kind of sits in the market.
So I've just done my first run with the Polar Pacer Pro. It was a pretty easygoing 10K, my first kind of run since Brighton Marathon at the weekends, and that was kind of at 7-minute, kind of 50-mile pace. I was running with the Garmin Epics on my other wrist, and that was paired to a MyZone heart rate monitor chest strap to kind of measure up the heart rate kind of accuracy on the Pacer Pro. Now, the first thing I would say about this watch, first of all, is from a kind of design point of view, it's a really nice, light, comfortable watch, which is what I'd like to see from a running watch in general. It's nice and thin. You've got some kind of characteristics that we've kind of seen on Polar watches before. These kind of textured, kind of physical buttons that you've got here. There's no touch screen here, which, you know, obviously is not a massive deal here. And the strap was nice and comfortable, nice kind of stretch to it. Polar has kind of changed the way or made it easier to take the straps off. For the Pacer Pro, it's kind of adding a kind of adapter that lets you take out the straps. I mean, personally, I would prefer the kind of pin mechanism you get on a lot of watches. At least it does give the opportunity to take the straps out. But yeah, the strap was pretty comfortable for me. Big deal here really is the screen. Now, it's a memory in pixel display that Polar pretty much uses. Personally, I prefer the kind of transfective displays you get on Garmin watches, and I think on the display technology and Coros watches as well. But I do think there's some improvements here, some kind of minor ones, but there are improvements at least. I think the first thing is you definitely get a kind of higher contrast level on this screen, so that's definitely going to help in terms of kind of visibility. I was running in pretty good light conditions, not too bright, but I could definitely notice that there's a difference in terms of that contrast level on this screen. The other thing I would say is Polar's talked a little bit about kind of beefing up the processing power on this watch, which I definitely think this is something that's needed. Kind of in the watches I've used recently, the screen's been very laggy, very slow to kind of operate. It definitely feels a little bit more snappy in terms of kind of switching through screens. I don't think it's still amazing, but I definitely think it's improvement on that front. In terms of kind of data accuracy and how I kind of found it, on that 10k run, the Epics definitely clocked me in early on the 10k. The Polar wasn't too far behind, but it was a little bit. There was a little bit of difference in terms of distance tracking, but generally the core metrics were kind of there and thereabouts, so kind of what I would expect to see. In terms of the heart rate monitoring, you know, I was running at pretty steady pace, which I think a lot of optical sensors do hold up pretty well on that front. It pretty much matched up in terms of average and max heart rate for me. So generally no kind of major issues there, but ultimately where it's really going to be tested is in the high intensity stuff, which, you know, Polar watches in general have struggled a little bit, and it's a reason why they still work with external sensors. Polar has sought to kind of improve the optical heart rate experience, so there's extra LEDs in here. As I said, the steady kind of run that I did, it was pretty solid overall. The true test is going to be in that high intensity. In terms of battery life, I saw kind of a 5% drop off, which was kind of under kind of 50 minutes of running. So fine, nothing amazing there. You know, it's nothing I've kind of experienced differently from Polar watches generally in terms of kind of, you know, almost an hour's worth of running basically. So first run, pretty good. I definitely think the design is nice, kind of what you would want from a running watch. I think the display is a little bit better in terms of what I've seen in previous Polar watches, and the processing power definitely seems to kind of shine through there, I think, although I still think it could probably go up a notch as well. And then data was generally fine for me, what I would kind of expect. So kind of solid first run for me with the Polar Pacer Pro.
So I took the Pacer Pro for a 1 hour run earlier today, and I have to say the performance really was very kind of similar and reminiscent of all the kind of Polar watches I've used recently. Screen is perhaps a touch brighter, but it wasn't massively noticeable on the run for me. You know, it feels a bit lighter and sleeker on the wrist for sure, and it still delivers kind of the same metrics in the same way as things like the Vantage V2 and Grit X Pro. You know, that is great because you're getting a cheaper watch here. So on the first run today, the GPS was really very solid. I compared it against the Garmin Epix 2 in multi-band mode, and the Polar track, you know, very close to it throughout the run. A couple of very small wobbles where it had me on the wrong side of the road. But although this isn't looking like it's going to be one of the top GPS watches because it hasn't brought multi-band support in, it still was doing a very solid job for me. Heart rate was kind of the usual at a very, you know, relaxed, easy, steady pace, which I was running for most of the run. It was pretty close to a chest strap reading, but when I went up a hill and in my heart rate spike, the Polar Pacer Pro took a while to catch up to that spike and kind of missed another little spike. So probably going to be the usual story. You know, it might be a slightly upgraded sensor, but we'd always recommend getting a chest strap to get the best readings from your watches, especially when they're coming with extensive training analysis like Polar's watches do. In terms of battery life, over the 24 hours I've had the watch, it's dropped 20%. That included a 1 hour run, a 20-minute yoga session. But Polar's watches do tend to drop a lot more kind of in general use than other brands. I think that's mainly because they're doing slightly more intensive kind of readings at night, I think, which is why they drop a bit quicker. So yeah, battery is going to be hopefully lasting kind of 5 to 7 days with fairly heavy use in terms of running, but it is going to be short of other brands. but it might be a bit of a trade-off for the analysis you get at night. Overall, design I really like. I think it's all the things I want from a watch really. You know, it's smaller, sleeker, lighter than the other Polar watches. You know, I have quite small wrists and generally I veer towards lighter, smaller watches, and this looks really nice. That big black ring is always a bit of a shame on Polar watches around the screen, and it's still not a particularly impressive screen in general, but yeah, it's quite a nice watch to wear and look at on the run and otherwise.
For my first run test, I've only taken this for like a 1 hour run. In that time, the battery life burned around 5%. That's supposed to be a 30-hour battery life, so it's going to be interesting to see how that kind of scales up. I'm going to reserve judgment on the heart rate and the GPS accuracy for when done deeper testing. So I'm going to move on very quickly from that and talk about design. Well, from the first impressions of this watch it's a really nice, lightweight, slimline build. I love the fact that there's no protruding kind of heart rate bump that sits nice and snug against the wrist. And yeah, it feels, you know, it's a fairly good looking watch. It's it's not that plasticky, it's not that kind of premium. It's sort of sitting nicely somewhere in between. That screen brightness that Polar have talked about being better, it does feel like it's enhanced up against some of the other watches that we've seen, but I'm still not really blown away by it. Maybe that's just because we've been spoilt by the Garmin Epics. But yeah, even up against like the Garmin Enduro, which I've been using here, you know, there's not too much to choose between, but you know, it does a good job, it's ample. The one thing I'm not so keen about really, you're still getting quite a large bezel around the actual watch face itself, and that does kind of take away some of that kind of screen real estate that you might have. You can still see your stats pretty easily on this watch, but you know, again, when we're starting to see sort of slightly more kind of edge-to-edge sort of designers on watches, this does sort of still feel a little bit old school. The buttons seem responsive enough to me. There's no lag when I'm moving through the screens. No touchscreen on this, doesn't really bother me, it might bother some people. Now what I'm really most interested in, I think, about this watch though, is the fact that the value for money that it potentially represents here. So you've got a really kind of full feature set. It's kind of getting very close to the kind of full suite of kind of running, training, recovery kind of features that you'll find on something like the Vantage V2. It's not quite there, but it's not far off. And so for £259, you know, what you're getting here is a lot of running watch for the money. Fuel-wise, hill splitter, turn-by-turn nav, route guidance powered by Komoot, all of those things are here as well. You're getting music controls as well, and don't forget you're getting a 30-hour GPS runtime battery life. Now that is pretty competitive. The only watch that really gets close to it, unless you're going to pay like £50 more, is the Coros Pace 2, which that is actually cheaper, and you'll get a slightly longer battery life for that, but there's nothing else that comes near it for that 30-hour battery life. So if that holds up in our tests, that's going to be really quite compelling. Yeah, so first impressions, you know, it feels like a pretty standard kind of Polar running watch with a few nice touches. But I think what's really going to be the make or break is that kind of full feature set when we've gone through and tested all of those to see if this really can represent a really, really good value for money watch.
So the Polar Pacer Pro I think is a really interesting addition from Polar to their range, and for me it's kind of the standout option really. So when I look at what's available extra on things like the Grit X Pro and the Vantage V2, there's nothing there that I consider really that important or essential to me. Overall this is a really nice addition to Polar's range. I think it makes a lot of their best features accessible to more people, and it really makes them much more competitive in the mid-range market, going up against things like the Garmin Forerunner 245 and the Coros Pace 2, although that is a lot cheaper. I think it's odd that they've marketed it so specifically at runners when it is a multi-sport watch, and that will help it kind of stand out against the Forerunners in that kind of price point in particular. But basically, yeah, you're kind of getting, I think, the best of Polar in a cheaper watch, and that's a good thing, even if there isn't anything new and exciting here to shout about. I think the really actually exciting addition could be the Pacer watch, the cheaper version of this, because I know it's losing running power and all the navigation features, but it's coming in at £170. It could be a really impressive option if it's still offering Polar's detailed training load analysis and, you know, kind of good battery life and good tracking performance.
So initial thoughts on the Polar Pacer Pro off that first run is that it was pretty solid. Nothing kind of groundbreaking for me in that first run that I really noticed. It feels like it's going to be a really strong running watch in terms of what you're going to get here. I think the key thing for me is kind of comparing it to what's out there around this price. You're talking kind of £250, £260. So things like the Garmin Forerunner 245, and then things maybe like the Coros Apex, which is kind of getting kind of shifted out, but it's still kind of there around that price as well. I would say maybe the Garmin is probably a bit nicer in terms of a kind of smartwatch experience and getting those kind of extra running features as well. And then kind of the Coros Apex, I think it's you're getting a kind of strong running focused watch there, or kind of tracking experience there as well. I think this is going to kind of sit there really nicely with those watches. I think if you like a kind of lighter, thinner watch, I think that's kind of what you're going to get here. The battery life, generally in terms of what Polar is touting here, kind of a week's worth of battery. I think is pretty much what you're going to get at this price range as well. So it sits well in terms of what else is out there. Whether it's going to be better, I mean, only kind of time will tell in terms of the testing, and whether that experience in terms of the kind of training analysis you're getting here, there's kind of extra tests you're getting here, things like the walking test, and those kind of features that help you kind of assess your kind of fitness levels and where you are with your running. Really kind of get a sense of where this watch sits and whether it sits above those watches or with those watches in terms of performance. I think really for me the most interesting thing here is actually the Pacer, which is obviously cheaper, kind of sits around the Coros Pace 2 and the Garmin Forerunner 55. I think that's going to be, that's one I'm really interested to see how that performs, and if that can kind of perform really well in terms of the price that it's set at, that could be a really solid option. And there's some kind of really nice features, a lot of the features that are in this more expensive watch that are in that watch as well. I'm not making huge compromise in terms of what you're going to get on the Pacer compared to the Pacer Pro based on what I can see ultimately. So yeah, initial thoughts on the Pacer Pro. Looks like it's going to sit pretty well with the Forerunner 245 and kind of the Coros Apex and watches kind of at that price range. Is it going to be a groundbreaking watch? I'm not sure, but it feels like it's going to be a nice, another option at that price, kind of, getting you a little bit more in terms of features, but also if you can't or you don't want to spend more for kind of Vantage M2 or a V2, I don't want those kind of richer features you're going to get there. I think you're getting a lot of the good stuff here on the Pacer Pro for less money as well.
It's pretty hard to give a verdict after sort of such a short amount of time to test this watch, but the first impressions of this, with everything that's written down on paper and with how it feels on the wrist, I think and the feature set, first impressions are this is pretty good. It's going to be really interesting to test it to see if it can take on things like the Coros Pace 2, whether it can actually go and take on watches that are much higher up the tree, like the Polar Vantage V2. It's not a rugged build, but looking at the Grit X, all of those kind of things, we'll see. If anything here, what really I think is fascinating is kind of what it might do to some of the other watches in Polar's lineup. So you're looking at the kind of Polar Vantage M, where does that now sit compared to a watch like this? So that's going to take a lot more testing, which we will have on the channel, and I'm looking forward to getting into it.
So guys, that's our quick first run review of the Polar Pacer Pro. What do you think of this watch? Is this something that's really exciting you? Is it going to draw you to Polar from other brands? Or were you hoping to see a little bit more in terms of new features? Let us know in the comments below. Please like, subscribe, ring the little bell, and we'll see you next time.